This day today has been focused so much on conversations regarding bringing the global South voice, bringing a South by South collaborative voice, bringing in voices from the global majority, bringing in consensus and collaboration. And a recent area where we've seen all of these ideas really come true and the power of multilateralism and the voice of the global South come truly strongly is in India's recent G20 presidency. We recently concluded the summit, and the New Delhi declaration and the consensus in these really trying geopolitical times have actually given hope for what consensus and collaboration can truly look like, and also for India really emerging as a voice of the global South. What that means for climate action globally, for India, and for the global South is something that we want to discuss in the session right after this. And what that also could coalesce in terms of outcomes for COP28 is also something that will be a feature of this session. To get us started, I would like to invite on stage Aarti Mohan, co-founder and partner at Satwa, and she will introduce the session and invite the other speakers. You want to take the podium?
Yeah,
And you can.
can I? Hi, everyone. It's just lovely to be here this afternoon, bringing focus to the G20 presidency and the richness that in conversation, deliberation that it has brought to the global South. I'm Aarti Mohan, co-founder and partner at Satwa. We are a social impact support and consulting firm. We were born out of India and we're based in the global South and working to support different areas of impact across the global South. Our most important work over the last few years has actually been in anchoring collaborative action, and one of those is along with our partners as well at Climate Group, where we've had a chance to see what it takes to bring strengths, resources, and energies all together in the global South. And that came together in a way that has never been seen before in the India's G20 presidency. Over 300 consultations done across all states in India, which brought together a whole bunch of different organizations from across the world, leaders of state, having so many of these deliberations. And we had a really close insider view because we had the good fortune of having a team support the Sharpa through the and the MEA through this process. And that was the origin of this conversation, where we said, Climate Group and us got together and said, as the India G20 presidency shifts from Delhi to Brazil, it's a momentous occasion because Global South, for the first time in 3 consecutive years, is going to take leadership over the conversations on development, climate action, and inclusive growth that we're going to have as it moves from India to Brazil to South Africa. And it's no better time to, as a South cross South gathering here today, to bring focus on some of the learnings that we've had, insights we've had at the India's G20 presidency, have a discussion here and take it forward to COP. We are extremely grateful to the Indian government and the G20 Indian Sherpa and the Ministry of External Affairs. We have Honorable Sir Consul General joining us as well to open this session. So it is with great pleasure that in association with Climate Group and Climate Week NYC, as well as the Center for Global Energy Policy, University of Columbia, we're co-hosting this session, Indian G20 Presidency, Sparking Change, Galvanizing Action Leading to COP28. I request Divya Sharma, Executive Director of Climate Group, to join me and welcome the Honorable Consul General of India, Shri Randhir Jaiswal, for his opening remarks. Thank you. Over to you, Divya.
Thank you, Aarti. Welcome, everyone, to this panel on G20, India's presidency. May I request all those people who are standing at the back to please come in front. There are a lot of chairs here, and we would really like to see you all closer to us when we start our panel. I want to welcome all of you on behalf of Climate Group and Climate Week NYC. I hope you had a great week of discussions, deliberations, and an exciting week that you had witnessed in the past couple of days. I would like to just very quickly let you know about how this session is going to go. We will have the introductory part with keynote address and special address. And after that, we will soon jump into our panel. We have a great line of panelists today who are present with us, and we will be asking them exciting questions, and we are waiting for listening from them. It will be around lessons for the global stocktake at COP28, ambitions and outcomes from G20 Indian presidency. It will be followed by summary remarks from Mr. Balasubramanya, who is Principal Strategist at Climate Works Foundation, and closing remarks from Ms. Helen Clarkson, CEO of Climate Group. So without any ado, I would like to invite Mr. Randhir Jaiswal, Consul General, New York, Government of India, on the dais, please. He needs no introduction. He's had an illustrious career as a diplomat. He has been part of India's delegation at various climate change conferences and was part of momentous declaration that have happened in favor of climate action. So I would welcome Mr. Jaiswal. Please, we would like to hear from you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, thank you to Sattva and Climate Week and other organizers who are our friend from Columbia University for your gracious invitation. I was part of climate discussion years back, but thank you for bringing me back to my old fold. You know, in the last decade or so, I was there when COP happened in Cancun, it happened in Doha, it happened in Durban, and thereafter Rio +20, so on and so forth. And in those times, the sticking points used to be three principal ones, which continue to be those sticking points. One, of course, the question of climate justice, that rings a louder bell because we are talking of the South. And then the question of climate mobilization and technology. These three things continue to remain alive in the discussion, and we would like to see more to happen on each of these pillars if you want to raise ambitions, because countries across the world are doing what they can with their resources, but if climate justice is to be combined with mobilization of climate finance and development needs of the large portion of the world which is left behind, I think the action on these three seminal points is key. You know, day before we had a roundtable at the conference on clean energy, at the consulate, sorry. But that was more focused on what we are doing with the United States. There are huge opportunities for companies here and companies elsewhere to see potential investments in the green sectors in India. The Indian renewable energy space is expanding at a very fast pace. From 175 gigas that we produce right now, we have an ambition to, or desire, plan to produce some 500 gigawatts by 2030. So you can imagine how fast things are expanding. But going through the media and talking to several people here, we also see that, you know, we've seen a range of emotions in the conversation in New York. From hope, optimism, greater sense of urgency, still greater sense of urgency to be injected, to a degree of pessimism as well. And for the latter, of course, there are reasons for it, because weather patterns are changing very fast. Climate change is for real. You've seen what happened in Hawaii, in Canada, in Australia, and elsewhere in the world. So we all must do more because we have to lessen our carbon footprint, and we must come together. But just to stepping aside and giving you my personal understanding, since the time I was involved in climate change negotiation 2010 to 13, we've actually come a long way. So the story is not as bad as people think, or those adjectives would perhaps tell you. We have come a long way. Look at since Copenhagen, then Paris and Glasgow, the kind of global understanding we've been able to develop over net zero, the kind of people's movement that is there behind climate change action, and the presence of people in such large numbers here in this room attests to that. Yesterday, I was reading on the digital platform of a lady here, doctor, who was bothered about her son in school being given food in a packet or a package or a utensil, use and throw utensil, which had plastic microbes. So therefore, she took it upon herself to change the habit and introduced the steel thalis that you see in India. Steel thalis with those pockets. And that is now being supported by several foundations and doing very well. So people have really come forward. These are very small steps, but meaningful steps. Very meaningful steps towards climate change action. And, you know, at the level of business, look at the kind of commitment that is there today. Each and every segment of the businesses across the world have a decarbonization strategy. There are companies, conglomerates who are looking for net zero commitment. Even in India, Indian Railways has undertaken a commitment to become net zero, carbon neutral, net zero by 2030. In the case of Tata, which is a large Indian conglomerate, they want to become carbon neutral by 2045. So that is a sense of commitment in the businesses as well. And on technology, sitting in 2010, you wouldn't have realized the kind of technologies we are talking about today. Electric vehicles, storage, green hydrogen, national hydrogen missions being adopted across geographies, India, United States, and elsewhere. So all that is happening. Yes, we have to scale it up. We have to bring down the cost, especially of storage, and times when you're talking about limitations of lithium-ion technology. Other chemistries are being looked at. So all this is happening. So it gives a sense of hope, and I'm an optimistic person. Now, in this landscape, you know very well that where India stands. You know, among the G20 countries, we are the only one which has met all its Paris commitments. In fact, we met our 40% target of renewable energy 9 years in advance. So that is how fast India is moving. And even on carbon intensity for GDP, 33% was a target. We've taken it up in Glasgow to 45%. And even this 33%, we are there about to meet it or will be meeting ahead of time. So that is our commitment to climate change action. As part of Glasgow, it is our commitment to produce 50% of our energy needs from renewable sources and to produce 500 gigawatts of energy from renewable sources. If we actually meet our 500 gigawatts of target, which we should be doing, and if we get a hydrogen mix right, we'll be actually meeting 65% of our energy sources from renewable energy. That is 50%, 15% more than the target that we have set for ourselves as NDCs in Glasgow. What are the other changes that we've seen in the last several years in India? Energy access, huge. You know, within a short span of time of 18 months, we were able to connect 29 million households to electricity grids. We today, by 2020 or so, we were able to connect each and every hamlet and village in the country. That has allowed us, given us space to reduce our carbon emissions substantively and significantly. Because if you allow people cleaner sources of energy, obviously they do not burn X, Y, Z for their energy needs. Also on the expansion, energy transition, we are leading on the fastest energy transition anywhere in the world. Look at the expansion of renewable energy space in India in the last, say, 8-9 years, since 2014. Renewable energy, installed capacity of renewable energy in India has gone up 25 folds, which is 2,500%. So that is the scale that we are talking about. And also we are boosting manufacturing of solar panels, power equipments, and India is trying very hard to become a trusted global supply chain partner for the world at large. Our LED program, for example, is the largest program in the world, and it has helped us to reduce our carbon footprint by 40 million tons annually. So these are huge changes. All this is happening at the domestic level. What are we doing at the global level? 4, or I would say 5 platforms that we have set for ourselves is pushing and propelling global climate change action. International Solar Alliance, huge success, headquartered in India. 135 countries are members of it. More will be coming. It's open to all 193 UN member states. Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. Some 30 plus countries have become members, including several international organizations. I did not emphasize the importance of disaster resilient infrastructure. We saw what the kind of havoc the earthquake in Turkey had for the population there, and other natural disasters that we see across the world. And then mission lifestyle, that is mission life, lifestyle for environment. It is a call given by a prime minister to have a global movement, a global campaign, so that we change our behavior and make our lifestyle such that we embrace nature, we embrace environment. So all these things are very important. And of course, on the sidelines of G20, we announced the Global Biofuels Alliance. That's the fourth global platform that India has taken lead on. It is India's initiative. And then, of course, we have the India-Sweden-led leadership group on energy transition. So these are 5 global initiatives that India has started and in the last 7-8 years. So you can imagine the kind of commitment, determination that is there in our country, in our leadership, to drive forward climate change action. And then this year, many of you know, is International Year of Millets. There's a reason behind promoting millets. Millets are water-wise and health-wise. They're good for climate change action. Many of you are aware what's happening in Africa. Talk to anybody from there, from that continent, will tell you how serious the question of food security is. So the real answers in these solutions, if you promote millets, you're promoting climate change action. You can grow more millets with less water, and then you're promoting health of people. So health of planet and health of people going together hand in hand. Now finally coming to G20, the sense, the urgency that India has brought to global climate change action was seen in each and every paragraph or each and every outcome and conversation that we had at G20. Specifically speaking, I mean, there's a Green Development Pact now which countries have to follow, including all G20 countries and other international organizations which came to the meeting. We have taken a decision to start Green Hydrogen Innovation Center as part of International Solar Alliance. We also want to work with all countries together to see how we can expand or build the global green hydrogen ecosystem. And there's a commitment to triple renewable energy capacity by 2030. So all that, you know, is so helpful to meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. Mind you, talking of Sustainable Development Goals, mobilization of climate finance and mobilization of development finance was an important element, an important part of our conversation. And there again, we're talking not just of billions, but trillions of dollars so that the developing countries and the global south can meet their aspirations of their people. Finally, I'm an optimistic person, so I will leave the stage on a note of optimism. I was excited, and I was telling this to some of our friends, colleagues here, very excited to see what Mr. Fatih Birol, the Executive Secretary of the International Energy Agency, wrote. He wrote an op-ed in Financial Times which was captioned, "Beginning of End of Fossil Fuel Era." Basically, he says that the fossil fuel consumption is going to decline in this very decade. So that should be music to all of you who are so wedded to climate change. Let us come together to build a greener planet. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Jaiswal, for this inspiring keynote address. I would like to now have the video message that Mr. Amitabh Kant, G20 Sherpa, G20 India Presidency, has very graciously sent for us. He could not be with us in this room today. So are we ready with the video, please?
Ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished guests, although I couldn't be present in person, it is a pleasure to join you all virtually at Climate Week in New York, especially at such a pivotal moment for our planet and people. Over the past year, I've had the privilege of being India's G20 Sherpa during an incredibly ambitious and action-oriented tenure of the presidency. And I can safely say it has been an extremely challenging and rewarding year of my life. Today's world is marked by shifting alliances, rising global conflicts, and a growing resistance to international cooperation. These changes have eroded global governance, making productive multilateral discussions challenging. The reality is that we find ourselves in a multipolar world where incentives for cooperation are scarce, even when facing critical global crises like the climate emergency. Amidst the devastating COVID-19 pandemic, we witnessed developing countries grappling with the resurgence of poverty, growing food and energy insecurities, and mounting debt distress. These circumstances compel them to face a choice between protecting the people or fighting for their planet, a choice no one should face. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, we leveraged the G20 platform to champion a human-centric developmental approach. This approach ensured that the voices of the Global South were heard, enabling us to accelerate progress on both our climate and development agendas with minimal trade-offs. With the unanimous adoption of the New Delhi Leaders' Declaration, it is safe to say that we achieved our goals. We did so by staying firm on our commitment to address challenging questions on financing. Transitioning to a sustainable future hinges on industrialized nations honoring their pledge of $100 billion annually to support developing countries in their climate endeavors. Moreover, we push the G20 to recognize that emerging economies now contribute trillions of dollars to fulfill their nationally determined contributions, NDCs, to shift to clean technologies. We have established a Green Development Pact for the leaders for a sustainable future, firmly committing to both sustainability and economic growth. Additionally, we have endorsed high-level hydrogen principles, laying the groundwork for a global hydrogen ecosystem. Our launch of the Global Biofuels Alliance emphasizes our dedication to cleaner energy alternatives and reducing our carbon footprint. Notably, during the G20 presidency, we secured an agreement to triple global renewable energy capacity. We've also acknowledged the significance of critical minerals in the clean energy transition and set high-level principles for collaborative efforts in this regard. These accomplishments highlight the G20 commencement and its commitment to fostering a greener and a more sustainable world. It is important to understand national priorities in circumstances when negotiating on issues such as climate and energy transitions. We must also keep in mind that it is not the developing world that is responsible for historical greenhouse gas emissions. The goal has to be to bring all countries on board, build trust across the room, and ensure that incentives for a clean energy transition are aligned. The goal must be to build an enabling environment that consists of finance, technology transfer, and capacity building. Only then can we get all countries on board. Our path to consensus was challenging. The Russia-Ukraine conflict loomed, jeopardizing agreement on critical developmental issues. It demanded 200 hours of negotiation, 300 bilateral meetings, and 16 draft documents circulated among Sherpas. To put it into perspective, that's over 8 days of continuous deliberations. During this process, several key factors emerged as instrumental in driving our collective success. These elements not only reflect the spirit of the G20, but also embody the leadership that guided our negotiations. First, developing nations like India, Indonesia, Brazil, and South Africa partnered effectively. Later, during emerging markets meeting with Mexico, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Argentina, and others, we united to rally support for our efforts. This alliance reshaped the focus on development and finance. Secondly, Prime Minister Narendra Modi's exceptional leadership played a crucial role. His personal meetings with world leaders, not only at the G20 but also at the BRICS and East Asia meet, laid the groundwork for deeper cooperation at the summit. During negotiations, invoking the Prime Minister's name emphasized the urgency of the issues and the imperative for swift action. This approach paved the way for consensus on over 100 critical issues, including the Russia-Ukraine conflict, demonstrating the power of diplomacy, collaboration, and visionary leadership in the face of daunting challenges. Looking ahead to COP28, we must build upon the G20 promises to ensure an accelerated, just and fair clean energy transition. In the New Delhi Leaders' Declaration, we called upon all nations to align their nationally determined contributions with the Paris Agreement temperature goal, emphasizing comprehensive climate action, including economy-wide greenhouse gas reduction targets. G20 countries are also committed to contributing to a successful conclusion of the first global stocktake at COP28, driving enhanced climate action across mitigation, adaptation, and means of implementation and support. The New Delhi Leaders' Declaration sends a clear message. Enhanced climate ambition must be met with equal ambition on climate finance. We call upon all parties to set an ambitious, transparent, and trackable new collective quantified goal of climate finance in 2024, starting from a floor of $100 billion. Additionally, developed countries are urged to at least double their collective provision of adaptation finance from 2019 levels by 2025. As we move forward to COP28, let's remember the G20 promises and work together to ensure that they translate into tangible climate action, paving the way for a greener, more equitable and prosperous world for all. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Sharma couldn't be with us in person here, but that was an extremely inspiring, tone to set for the discussion we're going to have. And over this year, he's really demonstrated in so many different ways what can be achieved with collaboration at a global scale. And so very, very, germane to the discussion we are having around the South-cross-South collaboration at a historic level. And so with that, we'd love to move into the main discussion of this session. I would love to invite Dr. Melissa Lott, Senior Director at Columbia University. She will be joined on the panel by Dr. Aniruddha Dasgupta, President and CEO, WRI, Uday Khemka, Vice Chairman, Sun Group, Shloka Nath from the India Climate Collaborative, and Shri Arun Kumar Sharma with the International Finance Corporation and an advisor to various different climate finance initiatives. Over to you, Dr. Melissa. We're looking forward to this discussion.
We all have mics, right? We are all mic'd, so you can all hear us in the back, right? Yeah, perfect. So thank you all for joining in this discussion today. Thanks to each of the panelists, who I'll introduce in just a moment. First and foremost, just want to say what a pleasure it is to co-host this panel, along with the head of our India program at the Center on Global Energy Policy, Dr. Kaushik Deb. It's just a real pleasure to be here. It has been inspiring to watch all of the things that have been discussed in these opening remarks, and we're going to dive a bit deeper in this discussion. So with that, I'm going to introduce our different panelists. So first we have Ani Dasgupta, is President and CEO of WRI, where you work to advance the Institute's global vision to improve the lives of all people and ensure that nature can thrive. We also have Shloka Nath, the CEO of the India Climate Collaborative, a nonprofit focused on mobilizing philanthropic capital to accelerate climate action in India. Can't wait for when we discuss through some of the finance aspects of this. The ICC connects funders to high-impact solutions that restore our planet and build healthy and equitable future for all, while contributing to help India meet its development goals. We also have Uday Khemka, the Vice Chairman of the Sun Group of Companies, India, and an ardent advocate for new and renewable energy. And then we have Then we have Arun Kumar Sharma, who's the Senior Advisor of Private Sector Investment Lab. So we've been talking about so many things that have come out through the G20 presidency. There's a long list, as we said in the opening remarks. We can talk about the biofuels work that has been done. We can also talk about the Green Development Pact with its different 5 pillars that include so many different aspects of energy security, the just transition, as we work through circular economy design, climate finance, and also how we accelerate all of our progress around the SDGs. So I wanted to open it up with a couple of things. First, if we can just go down, I think the line will go in this order, if that's all right, and talk through first, what elements of the Green Development Pact are you most optimistic about when we talk about bridging the global north-south on the energy transition? And then related to that, if you had other kind of biggest takeaways from the G20 presidency. So small questions to start, small questions.
Thank you. First, I want to say what a great pleasure to be here and to be discussing this topic. So thank you very much for organizing it. All of you have 20 other things you could have done right now because it's a crazy week, but I'm so glad you're here. This is a very important thing that just happened and India's presidency. No one can beat Amitabh in saying what was achieved, so I'm not going to try it. But he did an incredible job on that. I just want to maybe three takeaways from myself from the questions that you just asked. I just think it is very important to see at what geopolitical context this meeting took place and what was going on in the world at that moment and that year that India, I actually participated with Amitabh in some of these deliberations and building up to this. And what was achieved. I don't want to repeat what was achieved, but I think the context of what was happening. All of you know the 20 countries that G20 is, they are make or break whether we will have a successful planet or not. And not just successful climate. We will have a successful planet where we will have decarbonized, nature is better, and people are thriving. Most people in the world live in most of the economies of the world, most of the carbon countries. So it's very important what this group does or does not. And you saw the list of things that was achieved. And I will mention from my perspective what wasn't achieved also. But on the what was achieved for me, the green development that you pointed out, I feel that is a shift. It is a shift from talking about how do we decarbonize the world to how do we grow in a greener way. These countries, actually the global south countries that I'm interested in, I'm from India myself, but my organization works with a lot of global south countries, all the big middle income countries actually all across the world, and how they grow differently. If you did a graph of where India is and how much growth will happen to India, for example, as a country till 2050, there's a huge space of actually that graph will be like this, and there'll be huge gray area of actual new growth. The question is what color that growth will be. Would that be green or not? And that is the discussion, and for me, that is what the focus should be, that India, for example, has to create jobs. It just demographically, the speed at which India is growing, I forget the numbers, I think 1 million jobs a month or something, some astronomical number. So that has to happen while you decarbonize. So the story of green growth is the story we want to focus on and help figure out how to do that in a way that is good for nature and good for people. So for me, that is a good shift. This happened, thankfully, exactly in the same week in Africa when President Ruto had Africa Climate Summit. This was the message, and I feel that shift from these global south leaders talking about how do we grow differently, how do we have a different economy, I think is a central part of what this is. And what they talked about, hydrogen, biofuel, these are all interconnected, but it is about economic growth that looks different, and that is what needs to happen for us to have a successful. So that's one thing I want to highlight. I also want to highlight what Amitabh just said. I think we have seen extraordinary partnership between the rhythm of Indonesia's presidency, India's presidency, and what's going to be Brazil's presidency. I think this is a very important arc. What is happening. We will see in Brazil how much of the focus is going to go to nature, but this economic growth story, I think, will remain a central narrative of what's going to happen. I think that is a very, very important part. What Amitabh did not mention, one of the other things of the presidency was actually focused on consumption and lifestyle. In this initiative called LIFE, Life, I must have heard of it. This is the first time we actually have a focus on consumption, which is such an important part of the story forward. We don't have enough materials to build this for everyone. There isn't enough cement in the world, enough sand in the world. So we have to live differently, use resources differently, consume differently, recycle differently. I mean, you reuse materials. So I'm so glad that was part of it, of the story. Another thing happened that was very, and I'm stop, I know I can rattle off, so I'm going to stop, is that actually the leader statement was more ambition than the draft. That is a sign of a good meeting. Because most of the time, the other way, it turns out the other way. The leader statement, I want you to please see those two things, the draft before the leaders meeting and draft after. It was actually more ambitious. This is a very good outcome. What didn't happen, I had hoped the tripling of renewable is very good. You know, the world needs to figure out how to get out of fossil fuel altogether by 2050. I wish there was stronger language on that. We need it. I do think this agreement is going to be a great setup for the COP meeting that's coming up.
Agreed. It certainly teed up a lot of good discussions, and great to highlight the context in which the conversations occurred. Really important. Shloka, do you want to take the next stab at it?
Sure, and I promised Melissa that I would be concise. So I'm going to try and sort of stick to the really sort of top level takeaways. But I think what you just said was really relevant. The context is incredibly important. There was a crisis of multilateralism before we went into the G20 presidency, and I think it's a success when we talk about collaborative multilateralism. So it was really a true example of sort of what can be achieved if we agree to collaborate. I also think that, you know, when it comes to sort of the G20, it was really set up to talk about debt. There are a lot of actors who came together, and that was the genesis of the G20. But in this case, we have, you know, a conversation around debt and development on one hand, and then on the other hand, you have a conversation around decarbonization and disasters. And the G20 had to bring these two conversations together this year. You're dealing with decarbonization in a year, for instance, that was the hottest on record, with multiple disasters across the world. So how do you sort of string those conversations together? I think that was fairly remarkable in how that managed to happen. I think quickly, because we're here at a philanthropy forum, I'm going to try to talk about my takeaways with regards to philanthropy and what came out of the G20. I think the first is around the energy transition. This was also just mentioned by my panelist right next to me. It's, I think, incredibly important that we have brought the energy transition back to the Global South. The Honorable Consul General mentioned the issue around climate justice, and I think that was a very, very important key aspect that came up at the G20 as well. It has brought the energy transition closer to people, and that is really important. We do need to think about, you know, powering livelihoods, for instance. We need to think about supply chains, mineral sourcing, etc. All of these pieces have to be brought into that conversation around the energy transition. And I think the G20 was a very valiant attempt to do that. That was really important, because once we get the political sustainability, we will get sustainability. The second was around crowding in private finance. I think the conversation at the G20 was really around how to make finance long, cheap, and convenient. And I think that's where philanthropy can come in and play a really critical role. We do need to de-risk and make projects cheaper, quite simply. We have to stretch capital over a longer tenure, and we have to think about how we make it easier to get finance in the first place. So I think that's a really critical sort of takeaway from the G20 as well. Last two, I promise. Nature-based solutions and investing in nature capital. It's not just climate, it is biodiversity, it is our oceans. We do have to think about philanthropy in a way that is not just carbon focused, but also natural capital focused. And I think that's a big takeaway, something we do need to take into COP28. There is going to be a big conversation around loss and damage. It's an important one. And that brings me to my final point around resilience and disaster proofing. We do have to massively scale up resilience efforts, especially in the most vulnerable districts across this country. We know that over 85% of India's districts are extremely vulnerable to climate impacts. That's 638 million people. So, you know, climate is here. This is not a future conversation. We have to sort of start dealing with those adaptation risks as well right now. Last point to sum it up, Melissa, at least for me, was the need to look at system-level transformations, whether it's industry or quality of life issues. You're talking about air, water, food, clothing. And then you see what technology and finance and the circular economy and a revived multilateralism can do. So that, for me, was really the essence of the GDP, or the Green Development Pact. Thanks.
That's fantastic. And I know so much of this systems level thinking, and then, as you said, resilience, because we are already seeing these changes. And how do we think about that when it comes to protecting the health of our communities? Really great points. Uday, could I pass it to you?
Well, I'm very grateful to be here with all of you, and delighted, and thank you for having me. I could not feel more inspired by my fellow panelists, starting with the Honorable Consul General, and to Amitabh Kant and to the other panelists, because I 150% agree with everything that's been said. So think of this as a building on session. It might be boringly devoid of disagreement, for which I apologize. I think what's happening here is a very tough act. It's a very tough act because You know, 100 years ago, we were what? A population of 150 million people in India. We're 1.4 billion today. The average Indian, I'm just taking an Indian perspective, just forgive me for a minute. 10 years ago was consuming 1/26th the average American. Do the maths. You want to develop like that, how does this work? 1 billion people consuming at that level messed us up, to your point about life. So what the G20 is trying to do, as Shloka beautifully put it, I find a deep tension at the heart of it, a very interesting tension. On the one side, we're living in the world of 10 years ago about a development strategy, which is integrated, which is inclusive, which is truly democratic, and raises standards of living to the level of dignity. On the other side, what's different to 10 years ago is we are on the edge of a precipice today at a system level as far as nature is concerned, and we know it because you're all qualified people. You're here for Climate Week. You understand where we are. So in this moment, with this double imperative, how are we doing? And it seems to me there are a number of important points. First, as Shloka said, and has been said by others on the panel, it was very much a G20 of bringing in the South, but in a couple of different ways. I remember when I was a young banker in the city in the 90s, we were the 13th largest economy on the planet. Today we're number 5. 4 or 5 years from now, hopefully we're number 3. There's a rebalancing that's happening between what was called the North and what's called the South. Secondly, we brought in Africa. So if today is the moment when, if we don't solve China, India, the US, we're all cooked, well, 5 to 10 years from now, it's going to be Africa. We've got to get that right too. So the Indian inclusion of Africa was a very, very critical moral and diplomatic and geopolitical moment. Because suddenly you have countries looking equally at each other as partners in this journey. It's no longer received wisdom from above. We've already referred to how it's been reframed. A lot of the issues were reframed, not only bringing in the South, but from a Southern standpoint. We've already talked about that, critical mineral supply chains, distributed energy, all of those points. But that's kind of important. Because if you don't bring along the development agenda, we cannot achieve the critical climate agenda. It just won't work. It'll break in this critical moment. Now let me step back from that unified consciousness to look at it purely from the point of view of someone obsessed with climate change itself and not holistically. It still strikes me we did pretty well. And the reason why we did pretty well is because we picked up on the themes of the last 15 years, like renewable energy. But we were at the cutting edge of the new themes of this era, whether it's biofuels, whether it's green hydrogen, even small modular nuclear reactors. I noticed there was subtle language there about abatement technologies, right? These are codes, removal technologies. We have CDR embedded in the language. That's pretty cutting edge for India and the G20 to be right up there in the mitigation leadership pathway on technology. On technology, also, we must recognize the sharing of the Digital India stack, which I don't think we've talked perhaps enough about quite yet. I do think solutions which seem to come only from the West, and many will come from the North, and the North is, a core part of the G20, and from the IRA, there'll be great companies coming from here all over the world, but there will be companies coming in the other direction as well. There will be technologies coming in the other direction. So that spirit of equal partnership, no one's the boss, no one's a junior, we're in it together. I think there was a tipping point in that sharing of technology as equals, looking at each other. And then we come to finance. Paragraphs 38 to 41 are worth looking at carefully. They're fascinating because they're deeply reflective of what's actually happening in the broader climate finance debate. Quietly, the work happening on the reform of the multilateral development banks to give them more flexibility on their balance sheets and tend to recharacterize that money as booting up and leveraging private finance. All of that is referred to in the text. And that is radically different to where we started. And I just want to go back. You referred to me as Sun Group and energy and so forth. But actually, today I'm wearing the hat of a climate philanthropist with the Khemka Foundation. And we started in Rio in '92. And I remember the atmosphere of the Indian delegation in Rio. We were defensive. We were like, how dare you crowd out our carbon space? Sure, we'll meet you in per capita emissions. What a different world we're in now. We may be, of course, committed to climate justice, but now we're co-creators of the pathway going forward. That's the difference. On climate finance, I actually think that that language that's embedded in the G20 declaration has a curious resonance when I feel proud of, I'm sorry, I should be talking G20 with a very dispassionate global air, but I talk as a proud Indian. We actually have a lot South-South. There's a lot of South-South institutional sort of hosting going on here. But what's happened today that get us to 15 gigawatts a year of renewable power, Consul General was talking about the scale of our renewable power. We think about what the de-risking processes were. For 15 years, getting those PPA and regulatory regimes right, all of that, and how that's been more recently replicated with electric buses. That's all stuff we can offer the Vietnamese Jet B. It's South-South learning that can go, and I'm sure in other directions too, not just India being the leader. There are many things that, digital payments on cell phones in Africa, we can learn from. But that South-South space is also opening in a powerful way. Finally, I would say that de-risking that's embedded in the 38 to 41 paragraphs, that de-risking that's prefigured in what I just said about India's journey, is something that is critical to what the Sherpa was saying right at the end, Dr. Amitabh Kant. You might have noticed he ended on finance. You'll find the rousing words always about other things, and right at the end, people end up on finance very often. Because we need the money. We need $1 trillion of extra global finance every single year in the South. We think, Stern Songway says, about half of 2 trillion or over 2 trillion will come from domestic resources. 1 trillion. Frankly, the 100 billion, 200 billion we're talking about is nothing. It's irrelevant. What we really need to do is use that 100 billion, 200 billion to de-risk our environments so that these vast pools of pension and sovereign capital that have been accumulated across the planet can get good returns for their pensioners in growth economies like the South. And that's the great challenge of this. And that's why these coalitions, whether it's the International Solar Alliance, the Biofuels Alliance, these are just, in my opinion, maybe I'm wrong, these are coat hangers. These are places to be populated with real initiatives. And those can de-risk those sectors to the point where we can attract that kind of capital. It's a wonderful start, but it's only the beginning of huge amounts of work. The last thing I'd say is, you are the elite. I often think, gosh, we are such a tiny group of people on this planet. We are such a tiny, we all know each other, we bump into each other in Nairobi but it's a tiny group. 7 billion people depend upon us. So I'd urge you to use every minute of every day, because unfortunately we're not in 92 and the tipping point's around the corner. Thank you.
Arun, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you. Well, firstly, I'm a last-minute speaker, so allow me to introduce myself. You would not find me in the program. As I was just asked by Vipul and Nidhi to show up at the last second. And the fact that I'm here just shows how important the topic is, without knowing what at all this was all about. But I think Uday has given a wonderful segue into what I need to say. One of the first things, just to introduce myself, I'm Arun Sharma. I work for President Banga of the World Bank on his initiative to scale up climate finance using private sector engagement. That's my current responsibility, which is one of the reasons I'm here. I also am involved at 2 other levels in this space. One is at the level of climate resilience for underserved segments of the Indian population, but eventually global population, through Secretary Clinton's Climate Resilience Fund, which I'm trying to help raise. And then I'm also involved in India's first private equity, pure play private climate finance equity vehicle. So I'm kind of involved in multiple ways. Now, just coming back to the subject, of today's discussion on the G20 specifically, there are 3 or 4 things that I'd like to say. First, the G20 was a particularly momentous event, not only for the world, but I think also specifically the World Bank, because our mission and our role in the global financial architecture, but also in the fight against climate change, was endorsed as never before at this event, where there was no doubt that the G20 considered the World Bank as fundamental to the achievement of these aspirations, which have been so eloquently expressed by my co-panelists. And there is no doubt that a lot has been put on the World Bank. I mean, already there was a lot of focus on reforming the institution that was more intended to make it a more efficient, better operation, and then eventually a bigger operation. But first and foremost, the idea was to see how we can sweat our balance sheet to do more with the resources we have, and then hopefully ask for more resources from our shareholders. But when you look at the numbers that have been cited, and I think all of us agree that these are not numbers pie in the sky, these are things that people are seeing. Even if we are successful in recalibrating our risk policies and getting our rating agencies to allow us to do more with the balance sheet we have, we are nowhere close to delivering the kind of numbers of money that are required. So, and neither do the philanthropies have that money, nor do governments have that money. So the private sector is the one that has that money. It's just the way the world has evolved over these years, particularly in the last 50, where the bulk of humanity's resources are with the private sector. And as it so happens, that's just the reality, is largely private sector in the north, the global north. So the challenge that Mr. Banga has taken upon himself and the World Bank Group is how do we actually move the needle on mobilizing this private capital for these ultra-high priorities. We have been mobilizing private capital primarily at the IFC, but some at the World Bank. But it is a very low ratio. It's 1:1, 1:2.5 sometimes, depending upon how you count it. So the question is, well, how do you actually move this ratio to 1:10, 1:15, so that we at least start coming close to the kind of money that is needed to affect those changes? And the reason why the World Bank is particularly important is not only in its convening power, in its de-risking power, etc., but it's also important that the flow of capital occurs in a responsible way. There's plenty of capital flowing to emerging markets, so much so that 60 countries are at the brink of debt default. That's capital flows, but in the wrong way, because when that capital has been flowing, nobody really has an accurate idea exactly how much this money has been used for what. And one of the things that the World Bank Group as a whole does every single time it gets involved, and we are not particularly popular sometimes for it, is that we insist on a lot of transparency, on a lot of, I would say, governance around how the money is used, and support that with the knowledge bank capability we have in actually getting things done. It's one thing to say we need this much billion, but how much capacity do we have in some of these target markets to actually use the money in a way that will actually make a difference? And so there is, therefore, a very important reason why the G20 has put this focus on the World Bank's capabilities. It's not simply because we are the only global multilateral, but the fact is that it's also a knowledge bank in addition to a financing institution. And the intent is to deliver this money along with the governance, the knowledge, the capacity building, the technical assistance that gets ever more important as technologies emerge, as risks that were really not understood before or still are not understood have to be taken. And how do we create the capacity to essentially make more informed decisions rather than saying, okay, we'll give 20% first loss or whatever, and go ahead with it. And because if you do a wrong project, even 100% first loss makes no difference. You lose all the money. So in order to give effect to these aspirations, we've launched, actually as of this morning, quite coincidentally, what is called the Private Sector Lab, which I'm advising on behalf of the World Bank Group, to actually convert this conversation from a high-level conversation to a discussion that's anchored in market reality. So the purpose of this conversation is to cause the private sector to be very specific. Instead of having these generic statements of saying we need X billion and Y billion, we need the private sector to tell us in which countries do you need this money, in what is stopping you from doing it, what the World Bank can do to actually remove those obstacles. And the intent is to essentially develop what we call a credible ask, an ask for ourselves and an ask for our shareholders. So if somebody tells me that I need to do renewable energy or green hydrogen or electric mobility in Africa, well, tell us exactly what is stopping you. And the outcome will be a binary outcome. Either we can do it ourselves with the current capabilities, however enhanced by our evolution roadmap, which we'll announce a couple of weeks in Marrakesh. And the second one would be where we can't do it, and then we go back to our stakeholders saying the market is telling us, I need credit enhancement on these sub-investment grade bonds, or I want MEGA to be able to wrap countries' risk that are below BB minus. Because today, in this morning's meeting, I can share with you, one of the members from Africa, one of the largest banks, said, listen, you guys are not really helpful because your sovereign risk guarantee agency, MEGA, your capability ends at BB minus. And most of my countries where I'm trying to operate and expand are below BB minus. And you are the last, if you won't wrap it, who will? And so now that's a discussion that we need to take forward to our stakeholders. Say, listen, MEGA's charter is to reinsure everything commercially. Now, if you want us to do this, we know it's not going to be a commercial solution, but we need to find a way where we can make it economically rational for commercial investors to reinsure MEGA by essentially having some kind of semi-commercial capital come in there to act as the buffer. So that's the kind of conversation we're going to be having, and it is kind of open sourcing this entire conversation with the private sector in a way that results in credible action. So I'm very thankful, I think, on behalf of my president to the G20 for giving us this mandate, but also we are very conscious and cognizant of our responsibility that we've got to deliver. Thank you.
So as I go through the list of questions I know we wanted to get to, I just kept ticking them off, except for one. So that's the one we're going to address right now. And it's talking about this global outlook for fossil fuels. We've talked about renewables, we've talked about finance, we've talked about the SDGs, we've talked about how I know we didn't say it, but circular economy, how we think about making this entire thing sustainable and getting our supply chains on board. But when we look at the global outlook on fossil fuels, phase out, phase down, subsidies, just all those big words, I'm gonna ask just for a couple of brief comments on how we see this playing out as we go into COP here very soon, into what will be a very interesting discussion coming out of the discussions we're in this week. Ani, I was gonna give it to you first, just for a couple of thoughts on that.
I think that my thoughts are the fact of what needs to happen if you believe in 1.5 degree or net zero. IEA publishes it. We all know this. So that is not a debatable question. But IEA has also published this week that actually on solar, the amount of installed capacity and what is happening in process is actually going to exceed. And we don't, no newspaper writes it than what we need by 2030. This is very good news. This doesn't mean they're there yet, but that is what's being installed. We're not there and win that much yet or on storage, but things are actually moving in the right direction there. I think the question is, for us, I'm talking about this is WRI's perspective, that every country would have to transition. Every country's story will be different because where they are, where the starting points are. And the question is, how do we get a differentiated outcome that actually goes to the same goal, but the journey of each country, it needs to be what they are and what their plans are, and how can we support them in getting there. And how do we actually balance between how we actually invent a new energy system while actually creating, no country, no leader in the world is going to accept an energy system that's not reliable. No one will. So we have to figure out a process. And that's, our view is, we did a big piece of work last year when the energy crisis took place after Ukraine. There was a lot of debate on gas. If you know, Europe was trying to buy gas. There's a whole debate on it. and at the same time, you work at the World Bank. I used to work at the World Bank for many years. We took a policy decision of not funding this work. And when we did studies country by country, and this is what's important, and every country's journey is different. Some people have gas, some people don't have gas. And that specificity, this is where World Bank is very important, and supporting that specific journey as the goal is straight is what we need to look at. And that's what our recommendation is. I do think the fault point in COP would be about phase out or phase down. It would be about abated and non-abated. And that's what I heard, at least this week, and I don't see that being resolved very anytime soon.
So I know that we're very short on time, so I'm going to ask the remaining three up here for, let's say, two things, 2 words, 2 sentences that talk about, when we think about enabling conditions around getting renewables targets to be hit, accelerating the movement of finance, phase out, phase down, unabated, abated, pick your favorite when it comes to that whole discussion. But if you had to say 2 things that are enabling conditions that could further accelerate and fast track a just transition, what would they be?
Really quickly, I think one is focusing on tying employment to RE capacity through reskilling, upskilling. I think that's going to need to be a really big focus going forward. The second is, I think we really have to employ a welfare and social equity lens, especially as our renewable energy capacity and development grows. There is huge potential, especially within distributed renewable energy, to connect both renewable energy progress with SDG progress, but I think that's a matter of addressing energy access issues, across the country, especially in areas where there is poor electricity access, etc. So that's something we have to, I think, really bring into the conversation and build in livelihood incentives into that RE uptake. The third is remain attentive to the human nature, balance. Eventually, rapid development and deployment of renewable energy resources is going to mean really sort of extracting natural resources. And that means that we have to account for both the human and environmental rights that might be infringed upon, whether it's ensuring indigenous populations, low-income rural communities, or even land and water-dependent communities. The fact that their interests are safeguarded is going to be critical. And the final point is, of course, respecting planetary boundaries. Again, this is a conversation around threats to biodiversity. We do have to ensure that the energy transition is inclusive. One thing I would just say is the energy system is not disparate or distinct from the food system or the land system or any other system that we refer to within the economy. They are all interconnected, and we have to sort of take that zoomed out lens and approach to how we're thinking about fundamentally transitioning the economy. It includes people, it includes all living beings. This has to be a broader, more expansive conversation rooted in social justice just as much as it is in carbon. Thanks.
And that was their signal that we have approximately a minute left. I know, I mean 0, but 1 minute, we're going to take it.
I'm sorry, Uday.
No, it's fine. We never have enough time for these discussions, ever, but we'll start them. Can I give you gentlemen 30 seconds each to give 3 words, I guess?
We've just published a paper. I'll give you the reference.
I love it. I'm an academic.
No, for the last 17 years, we've worked with sovereign wealth funds and pension funds to look at actually moving large amounts of green finance into emerging countries. We think there's a huge opportunity that is being ignored about taking experiments on de-risking from all across the emerging markets and putting them into comprehensive de-risking processes and frameworks. These can be embedded in existing multilateral institutions so that the limited amount of concessional finance comes in stage 4 of a 5-stage process, which is de-risked ab initio and then syndicated to institutional investors in the end. There's a paper on it. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And final word to Arun.
I don't know if this is working. Yeah. So I think the key immediate win in this would be standardization, especially on the hard to abate and the transition finance sectors, where investors need to know, what is a good pathway or which is not a good pathway, and they are not willing to invest right now by the simple fact that they want to take the reputation risk that they finance project or finance a sector that does not deliver transition or is going the wrong way or not going fast enough. So, and that's one of the asks that has been made actually on the World Bank in these recent discussions. And clearly that's not, the World Bank is not really a certification agency, but that's a new ask. And we need to find a solution to get these standardization solutions up and running quickly instead of another 5 years of discussions. Thank you.
Time is short, that's for sure. Please join me in thanking our panelists for this great discussion.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and it was a wonderful panel.